I still remember the silence before there was a nation called the United States. Long before towering skylines pierced the clouds, before highways stretched across continents, and before millions proudly called themselves Americans, I stood in a land unlike anything the modern world could imagine. Endless forests covered the horizon. Rivers carved their way through untouched wilderness. Massive herds of bison shook the earth beneath my feet, and thousands of thriving indigenous communities had already built civilizations, cultures, languages, and traditions that had flourished for thousands of years. Most people believe the story of America begins in 1776. It doesn't. To understand how the United States became one of the most influential nations in history, I first had to journey back thousands of years to a time when nobody had ever heard the words America or United States. And what I discovered completely changed the way I understood this country's past. The first people arrived here during the last ice age, crossing a frozen land bridge connecting Asia and North America. Generation after generation, they spread across mountains, deserts, plains, and coastlines, adapting to every environment imaginable. Over thousands of years, hundreds of distinct nations emerged. Each possessed its own government, beliefs, technologies, and traditions. I found enormous cities that rivaled many found elsewhere in the world. I walked through sophisticated trade networks stretching for hundreds of miles. Agriculture flourished. Engineering advanced. Entire civilizations rose and disappeared long before European ships ever appeared on the horizon. Yet almost everything was about to change. Far across the Atlantic Ocean, powerful kingdoms searched desperately for faster trade routes to Asia. Gold, spices, wealth, and prestige drove ambitious explorers into waters many feared to cross. Nobody realized those voyages would reshape the future of the entire world. In 1492, the Atlantic ceased to be an impossible barrier. When European explorers arrived, they did not discover an empty continent. They encountered millions of people already living here. At first, curiosity defined many encounters. Trade began. Ideas were exchanged, but those first meetings soon gave way to competition, conquest, and devastating disease. Entire communities vanished. Diseases carried unknowingly across the ocean spread faster than armies ever could. Villages emptied. Ancient traditions struggled to survive. The balance of power shifted with astonishing speed. As decades passed, more ships arrived. Spanish explorers claimed vast territories in the south and west. French traders ventured deep into river systems. Dutch merchants established prosperous trading settlements. Then came the English. Unlike many earlier expeditions, the English intended to stay. In 1607, I watched the settlement of Jamestown struggle to survive. Hunger, disease, conflict, and harsh winters nearly destroyed the fragile colony. More than once, it seemed inevitable that the settlement would disappear forever. But somehow it endured. Then came tobacco. One crop transformed everything. Demand exploded across Europe, bringing wealth, investment, and thousands of new settlers. Plantation agriculture expanded rapidly, forever changing both the economy and the landscape. Yet prosperity came with an unbearable human cost. Forced labor grew into a brutal institution that would shape American history for centuries. In 1619, enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, marking the beginning of a system whose consequences would echo through generations. Even as settlements expanded, another transformation quietly unfolded. Families crossed the Atlantic searching not only for opportunity, but also for religious freedom. Puritans established communities throughout New England, hoping to build societies based upon their deeply held beliefs. Life remained extraordinarily difficult. Winters were unforgiving. Food was never guaranteed. Relations with indigenous nations shifted constantly between cooperation and violent conflict. Still, the colonies grew. One settlement became 10. 10 became 13. Roads connected villages. Ports filled with ships. Merchants prospered. Farmers cleared forests. New generations no longer thought of Europe as home. Without realizing it, they were becoming something entirely different. By the early 18th century, these colonies had developed their own identities. They traded across the Atlantic, elected local assemblies, built universities, published newspapers, and argued passionately about liberty, government, and individual rights. But while prosperity increased, so did tension. The British Empire had become the world's dominant power after costly wars against France. Victory brought enormous debt, and someone had to pay. That someone, Britain believed, would be its American colonies. At first, the new taxes seemed manageable. Then more arrived. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. Each law intensified anger. Colonists insisted they deserved representation before taxation. British officials insisted Parliament possessed complete authority. Neither side intended to back down. I could feel the atmosphere changing. Conversations in taverns became political debates. Merchants organized boycotts. Pamphlets spread revolutionary ideas faster than officials could suppress them. Ordinary citizens began asking an extraordinary question. What if loyalty to the British Crown was no longer worth the price? No one yet understood that within only a few years, 13 scattered colonies would challenge the most powerful empire on Earth. And once the first shots were fired, there would be no turning back. The uncertainty lingered in the air like the smoke from a dying campfire. Every conversation seemed quieter than before, yet somehow more dangerous. I could sense that people were choosing sides, even if they refused to admit it aloud. Neighbors still greeted one another in the streets, but trust was beginning to crack beneath the surface. Then everything erupted. In April of 1775, news spread with astonishing speed. Fighting had broken out at Lexington and Concord. What began as an attempt by British soldiers to seize colonial weapons turned into open resistance. Farmers, craftsmen, and ordinary townspeople grabbed their muskets and stood against trained soldiers of the British Army. There was no grand declaration yet, no promise of independence, only confusion. Many still hoped reconciliation was possible. Others believed the moment for compromise had already passed. I found myself watching families divided by a single question that would define their future. Would they remain loyal to Britain? Or would they risk everything for an uncertain future? The battles continued. Soon the conflict spread across the colonies. Volunteers poured into makeshift camps, many with little military experience. Supplies were scarce. Food was inconsistent. Ammunition was precious. Disease spread almost as quickly as fear. Yet despite every hardship, more people joined. Something larger than a tax dispute was beginning to take shape. In Philadelphia, representatives from the colonies gathered to debate their next move. Every discussion carried enormous consequences. Independence was no small decision. Declaring it meant becoming traitors in the eyes of the British Crown. Failure would almost certainly end at the gallows. The arguments stretched on. Some delegates urged patience. Others demanded immediate action. Finally, in the summer of 1776, the decision could no longer be delayed. The Declaration of Independence was approved. With one document, the colonies announced that they no longer recognized the authority of King George III. Instead, they proclaimed that governments existed to protect the rights of the people, and that those rights came from something greater than any king. The words were bold, revolutionary, dangerous. They inspired hope across the colonies, but they also guaranteed a long and brutal war. Britain had no intention of surrendering its most valuable colonies. The struggle that followed tested everyone. I watched the Continental Army endure freezing winters, exhausted marches, and impossible shortages. Uniforms wore out faster than they could be replaced. Many soldiers wrapped torn cloth around bleeding feet because they had no shoes. Hunger became an almost constant companion. At Valley Forge, survival itself became a victory. Winter covered everything in ice and snow. The cold seemed to penetrate every layer of clothing. Smoke drifted from crude wooden huts where exhausted soldiers huddled together, wondering whether they would ever see their families again. Many never did. Still, the army endured. Training improved, discipline strengthened, hope refused to disappear. Meanwhile, the fighting stretched far beyond famous battlefields. Coastal towns faced attacks from the sea, farms were destroyed, families fled advancing armies. Loyalists and patriots often turned against neighbors they had known their entire lives. This was not simply a war between colonies and an empire. It had become a civil war inside communities themselves. Just when British victory seemed increasingly likely, the balance shifted. In 1777, American forces achieved a critical victory at Saratoga. It was more than another battle. It convinced France that the revolution might actually succeed. That decision changed everything. French soldiers, naval forces, weapons, and financial support entered the conflict. The revolution was no longer an isolated colonial rebellion. It had become an international war involving some of Europe's greatest powers. Britain suddenly found itself fighting on multiple fronts across the globe. Even then, nothing was guaranteed. Years passed. Battles continued. Both sides suffered enormous losses. Entire generations grew accustomed to uncertainty. Children who had never known peace reached adolescence while the war still raged. Finally, attention shifted toward Virginia. British General Cornwallis established his position at Yorktown, believing his army remained secure. But events began unfolding that few could have predicted. American and French forces coordinated an extraordinary campaign. While soldiers closed in on land, the French Navy blocked escape by sea. The trap was complete. For weeks, relentless bombardment shook British defenses. Cannons thundered day and night. Smoke blanketed the battlefield. Every explosion brought the siege closer to its inevitable conclusion. Then, in October 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The fighting had not officially ended, but everyone understood what this meant. The revolution had survived. Years later, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States. The impossible had happened. A collection of former colonies had defeated the world's most powerful empire. Celebrations swept across the new nation. But beneath the victory lay an uncomfortable reality. Winning independence had been difficult. Building an entirely new country would prove even harder. There was no proven blueprint, no king, no central government strong enough to unite 13 very different states. Debt weighed heavily on the young nation. The economy struggled. Political disagreements intensified almost immediately. Leaders who had stood together during war now argued fiercely about what kind of country they had actually created. Some feared a powerful national government. Others feared chaos without one. The revolution had answered one question. It had created dozens more. As debates grew louder and divisions deepened, I realized the greatest challenge facing the United States was no longer defeating Britain. It was discovering whether this fragile experiment in self-government could survive its own freedom. Freedom was finally mine, but almost immediately I realized something unsettling. Winning a revolution was one challenge. Building a nation capable of surviving it was another entirely. The Articles of Confederation, my first attempt at governing myself, sounded promising on paper. In reality, they left the central government too weak to solve many of the problems threatening the young republic. States argued over borders, trade, and taxes. Debt from the Revolutionary War continued to grow. There was no effective way to raise revenue or enforce national decisions. For a moment, it felt as though everything I had fought for might unravel before my eyes. Then came a meeting that would quietly shape the future of the country. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia with the intention of improving the existing government. Instead, they chose to create something entirely new: the United States Constitution. Every word mattered. Every compromise carried enormous consequences. How much power should belong to the federal government? How much should remain with the states? How could liberty be protected without allowing disorder to take control? The debates lasted for months. They were passionate, exhausting, and often deeply divisive. Yet when the Constitution was finally completed and later ratified, it established a framework unlike any the world had seen: a government divided into executive, legislative, and judicial branches, each designed to limit the power of the others. It was an experiment, one that many doubted would last. When George Washington became the nation's first president in 1789, expectations were immense. There were no traditions to follow, no previous American presidents to imitate. Every decision set a precedent. Every success or failure would influence generations to come. As the years passed, the country expanded. New states joined the Union. Roads connected distant settlements. Steamboats transformed rivers into busy highways. Factories began replacing workshops. Immigrants crossed the Atlantic in search of opportunity, bringing new languages, customs, and dreams with them. But beneath this remarkable growth, one issue refused to disappear: slavery. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. A nation founded on the belief that all people possessed certain unalienable rights continued to deny freedom to millions. Political compromises delayed confrontation, but they could not eliminate it. Eventually, the divisions became too deep. In 1861, the Civil War erupted. It remains the deadliest conflict in American history. Families found themselves fighting on opposite sides. Entire towns were devastated. Railroads carried soldiers instead of settlers. Fields that once produced crops became battlefields scarred by artillery and loss. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost before the war finally ended in 1865. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished. But healing would take generations. Reconstruction brought hope, yet also hardship and resistance. The nation slowly rebuilt while continuing to wrestle with questions of equality, justice, and citizenship. Then came another transformation. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw astonishing industrial growth. Railroads stretched from coast to coast. Telegraph wires connected distant cities almost instantly. Skyscrapers climbed higher than anyone had imagined possible. Innovation accelerated: the telephone, electricity, automobiles, airplanes. Each invention reshaped daily life. The United States emerged as one of the world's leading industrial powers, attracting millions more immigrants who believed a better future awaited them. But prosperity was never guaranteed. The Great Depression struck in 1929, bringing economic collapse on a scale few had imagined. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Families lost homes and savings almost overnight. Breadlines grew longer. Unemployment soared. Just as recovery began, another global crisis demanded action: World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States entered the conflict alongside the Allies. Factories shifted to wartime production. Millions served in uniform. Scientific and industrial capacity expanded at extraordinary speed. When the war ended in 1945, the world had changed forever. The United States emerged as one of two global superpowers, entering decades of rivalry with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Nuclear weapons created the constant possibility of unimaginable destruction, while the space race inspired remarkable achievements in science and technology. In 1969, humanity reached the moon. For many, it represented far more than a technological triumph. It symbolized what determination, innovation, and cooperation could accomplish. At home, another struggle unfolded. The civil rights movement challenged segregation and discrimination, demanding that the promises written into the nation's founding documents apply equally to every citizen. Courageous individuals marched, protested, and endured violence to secure greater equality under the law. Progress came, not all at once, not without sacrifice, but step by step, the nation continued to evolve. The closing decades of the 20th century brought the digital revolution. Personal computers entered homes. The internet connected billions of people across the globe. Information traveled faster than ever before, transforming education, commerce, communication, and culture. Then came the 21st century. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 reshaped national security and foreign policy. Economic crises tested resilience. Medical breakthroughs saved lives while global pandemics revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of modern societies. Artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and space exploration opened new frontiers that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Today, I look across this nation and see extraordinary diversity. Bustling cities, quiet farming communities, towering mountain ranges, endless plains, innovative research laboratories, historic landmarks, millions of people, each carrying a different story, yet all contributing to an ever-changing national identity. The history of the United States has never been a straight path. It has been shaped by remarkable achievements and painful failures, by moments of unity and periods of deep division, by courage, innovation, conflict, resilience, and constant reinvention. Perhaps that is what makes this story so compelling. The United States was never built in a single moment, nor by a single generation. It has been created, challenged, repaired, and reimagined by countless people over centuries, each leaving an imprint on the nation that followed. And that journey is far from over. Because history is never just about the past. With every new generation, another chapter begins, and somewhere, someone is already writing the next page of the American story.